Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Amen. I confess I'm a bit of an Anglophile, so I was pleased with much of the rest of the globe with the announcement last year of the birth of little Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor, son of Prince Harry and Duchess Meghan. He seems a sweet child, was already adored by his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth of England. So it was a shocking juxtaposition to learn shortly afterwards that a BBC radio host tweeted out an image of a couple holding hands with a dressed-up chimpanzee with the caption, "Royal baby leaves hospital." The radio host was promptly fired. Racism is an ugly sin, and yet it is very poorly understood by those of us at the top of the heap, even when we have good hearts and intentions. Racism is a blind sin that, unless we are the victim of it or taught otherwise, we simply do not see how pervasive and insidious it is. The first time I ever considered the possibility that I was unconsciously racist was during a class I took in seminary in the early 90s. Over the course of several weeks, our professor shared with us what racism is and how those of us who are white benefit from it. At first, I was shocked. I'm not a racist. I advocate for people of color. I want equality in our country. I've marched to that parade. I was even a bit angry that someone would suggest I was a racist. But over time, I began to see the light. Maybe racism was something different than what I had originally thought. Last year at Clergy Conference, we were fortunate to have the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas as our keynote. She is a woman of color, Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union, and a dynamic speaker. Over the course of 2 days, she rocked our world. Alongside humor and scripture, she unveiled for us the dark underside of white privilege, helping us to see it, understand it, and give us a framework for responding to it. I was not the only priest with tears in my eyes at the end of both days. Powerful, powerful presentation. The thing is, most of us recognize blatant racism, like portraying people of color as a chimpanzee, and we can speak against such things. But the bulk of racism is hidden in unquestioned cultural assumptions. Assumptions which both elevate white people and the white experience, as well as denigrate Black people and the Black experience. This is why the country is marching for Black Lives Matter. We who are white need to open our eyes. These unconscious assumptions play out in ways big and small, which create stumbling block after stumbling block for people of color. We do not have a level playing field in our country. A few smatterings of the many examples that Dean Douglas shared with us. Many of them actually started historically because even though they began hundreds of years ago, the repercussions are still felt today. So one of the things she talked about was false studies from the early 19th century, which presumably show that Black people are not human. The argument was that Darwin's conclusion about evolution and being descended from apes only applied to Blacks, who are the beasts. 19th century. God obviously created them on the 5th day with all the other animals, while white people were created by God on the 6th day. Churches taught this stuff. Therefore, blacks do not need to be given the same rights as real humans. And just to be clear, modern genetic studies, study after study, show absolutely no genetic difference between white people and those of color. In fact, as a white person, you may be more closely genetically related to somebody of color than you are to another white person. We are exactly the same, and yet even today, more than 1/3 of white Americans rate black people as less evolved than whites. Think about that. If 1/3 of white America thinks blacks are less evolved, how do you think that unconsciously plays out in how they engage with their world? Another example, after World War II, as the GI Bill allowed returning white soldiers to go to college, buy a home, and live the American dream, it did not apply to returning black soldiers. Soldiers who just risked their lives just as much as white soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of black veterans were denied admission to colleges, loans for housing, loans for business, and excluded from job training programs. Huge numbers of white GIs received college degrees. Most black GIs weren't allowed to. So think about this. There are 2 soldiers, each of them risking their lives. They come back. One is given all these advantages and propelled into a prosperous future. The other is not. At the same time, there were redlining of neighborhoods. Red lines on a map created around the neighborhoods of African Americans, designating those neighborhoods as undesirable. So the same home in a white neighborhood would be worth much more than one in a black neighborhood. The white school would be better resourced than the African American schools, which meant black children started life off with a lesser education than white children. And since, as we know, much of middle-class wealth, most of us here, most of our wealth is tied up in home ownership. If you're denied said ownership, or the house you do buy isn't worth very much, you have less money to pass on to your heirs. Less education, less wealth. Schools are less resource. So it creates a vicious cycle of what is known as inherited disadvantages. So each subsequent generation of white people grows more prosperous, while each generation of black people stays impoverished. It's baked into the system, and it still is true today. Even today, black Americans are 105% more likely than white people to receive a high-cost mortgage, even after controlling for variables such as credit scores and debt-to-income ratios. And then let's say you get past all of these things and you achieve great things as an African American person. Finding a decent job is more difficult. In one experiment, researchers examined the level of racial discrimination in the US by randomly assigning identical resumes, either black-sounding or white-sounding names, and observing the impact on requests for interviews from employers. Results found that resumes with white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than those with black-sounding names. I'm sorry if I'm sort of going on about this, but it's just really shocking once you start digging down into it. Many times we white people resist the label of white privilege because we imagine it implies that we haven't struggled and that we didn't earn our place in the world. That is not the case. Of course, you cannot be a human being without struggling and working to earn your place. But white privilege should be viewed instead as a built-in advantage separate from one's level of income or effort. We've got this sort of extra headwind. It means that the countless daily advantages we experience that are invisible, nothing that we did individually per se, but that we derive advantage from. This includes also things like white people are less likely to be followed, interrogated, or searched by law enforcement because they look suspicious. If white people are accused of a crime, they're less likely to be presumed guilty, less likely to be sentenced to death, and more likely to be portrayed in a fair and nuanced manner by media. So we white people can look around and see black people are poorer than we are, less educated, and more likely to be in prison. And we generally don't think to ourselves, wow, their lives are so unfair. Instead, we think, wow, I guess black people are not as smart or successful or good or moral as white people. Which then, of course, that unconscious assumption feeds into the white privilege storyline, perpetuating and strengthening the racism, and it becomes this vicious circle. In the gospel today, Jesus warns his disciples of the cost of discipleship. That sometimes when we proclaim the gospel, some people won't like what they hear. Jesus is warning them. He's about to send them out on a mission. He says, beware of these things. These things might happen to you. For instance, when the gospel calls for equality, that means that some of us must give up power and privilege so that others can be equal to us. That will sometimes feel like the others are getting more than we are. And it can feel unfair, even though it is usually not true. But those in power will resist that equality. The gospel is not always good news. To some people, it's very challenging. And this unhappiness about the gospel will sometimes create division. As Jesus said, a sword between a father and a son, between a mother and a daughter. That division is our response to the gospel, even within families. Jesus is not encouraging division, but simply describing what happens when the status quo is questioned. There's a great quote by Dom Helder Camara, a Brazilian Catholic archbishop, who famously said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." When the gospel starts looking for equality for all people, those at the top resist. It's human nature. This is a tough subject. Gosh, on my second Sunday with you all, I'm going right for the jugular, and I apologize, but this is where the country's at right now. It's a tough subject, and it's been suggested that confronting the possibility that we benefit from white privilege is so hard that it is akin to going through the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining. What about this? What about that? Depression, manifesting as guilt and shame. And finally, acceptance. It's hard to consider the reality of white privilege. I get it. We are good people, and there is no shame in being white. But we have lost our way. Fortunately, healing is possible. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says, if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. Racism against our brothers and sisters is a way of shooting ourselves in the foot. White and black both lose because we're connected. It is the responsibility of white Christians to reach out in love to those who are suffering educate ourselves to the unconscious privileges we enjoy and seek to level the playing field. I encourage anyone who's moved to do so to attend a Zoom meeting this Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, where we will discuss Trinity's response to racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. This isn't the final answer, but it's a great place to start.